And I'm Tony, and Helen and Marissa are co-bosses as well as DJ Globes, spinning it up for us between our sets of talks and giving us some nice music. So let's give them a shout.
Ooh.
One of the weird things about doing these online is that's what we always say when we're in person and you hear it, but I'm just going to assume that all of you screamed into whatever room you are currently in a bunch of woos. Now, we want to also let you know that we are recording tonight's event. So if that is not something that you would like to be a part of, go ahead and keep your video off and yourselves muted throughout the presentation. And as a courtesy to our speakers, please keep yourselves muted throughout as well. If you do have a question, you can type that into the chat during the talks, and then at the end of the talks, we'll come back around to questions, and then we'll have you unmute yourself. We've not had any issues with people being disrespectful by unmuting themselves, but if anyone is disrespectful at any point, you only get that one chance, and then we're going to kick you out, and you will not be welcome back. So please don't make us do that. We know that you're not going to, but we got to say it anyway. So thank you all so much for being respectful of our speakers tonight. Our three speakers in order, Ethan Estess is going to talk to us about ocean art, science, and stewardship. And then Kapalikū Maile is going to tell us about the new exhibit that just opened at Bishop Museum called Regenerations, all about challenging racism, connecting Ohana. And then Dr. Chandra Earl is going to tell us about digitization, databases, and diversity, and how that relates to snails. So that is everything that we have coming up for tonight. And we're going to get started with our first couple of introductory things. So we want to tell you a little bit about the museum. Like I said, I do work there, as well as Kapalikū and Chandra both work there too. And then Ethan currently has an exhibit up called Plastic Free Pipeline. That's a wave made out of trash. And that's going to come down towards the end of this month. So if you haven't seen it yet, come on by. So we like to say at Bishop Museum that we have 25 million stories and counting, because that is the count of different items in our collections, 25 million. And part of the reason that we always do these events, the takeovers of Nerd Night in March, is because that's when we hold our Science and Sustainability Festival, is every year in March. And normally, and we do have it on, again this year, it was canceled last year because of COVID, but this year we are going to hold it on site with all of the safety measures in place that we've come to know. The theme this year is sustainable seas. There's a couple of different things that are going on all month long. So one of those is the Mai Kinohi Mai Surfing in Hawaii exhibit. So it's all about the history of surfing in Hawaii, and has a lot of really beautiful surfboards and photographs and things brought out from our collections. That is only going to be on view through March 28th, and is included in regular admission to the museum. So if you haven't seen it yet, or even if you have, come on by and take a look before it's gone. Saturday, March 6th is the Stars Tonight online. So that's another, it's our monthly recurring virtual planetarium program that I don't present that one, but I do help with it. We have another person who does those presentations, but that is from 7 to 8 p.m. It's free for Bishop Museum members and $6 per login for the general public. So hopefully you'll come and join us for that one too. And then finally, the day of our Science and Sustainability Festival at Bishop Museum is going to be on Saturday, March 20th. So we'll have representation from our collections and research folks, as well as other partners that work with us at Bishop Museum. And we'll have some guest speakers from NOAA as well. So they're going to be doing some virtual talks. They won't be there in person, but we'll have a space where you can watch those, and then we'll have ways that you can watch them online through Facebook Live as well. That event is going to be free for Bishop Museum members, and it's $5 for Kama'aina and military with ID. And we strongly recommend that you buy your tickets online ahead of time. So we just switched to having tickets available on a kind of hour window basis. So you want to get your tickets. You can stay for longer. We're staggering when people are coming in. So you'll buy your ticket for like 10 a.m. and then you arrive somewhere around 10 a.m. and you stay for a little while after that. So hopefully you'll come and join us at the museum soon, and we would love to see you there. Speaking of memberships, here's some information about our Bishop Museum memberships. So it's a really great way for you to support the museum and the work that we do, as well as get some great benefits yourself, including free admission to the museum, and also discounts on a lot of different special events. and other great stuff too. So the website that you want to go to check that out is bishopmuseum.org/memberships. All right, now at this point in our introduction, we normally talk about this month in science. However, this month we're gonna change it just a little bit. We're not gonna talk about science in general because this month was all about Mars. If you didn't hear, we landed another rover on Mars. It was a very, very exciting on the morning of February 18th. After 7 months in space, the Perseverance rover touched down on the surface of Mars right on time as they scheduled it. Everything went exactly according to plan, and it was really, really amazing. Now, one of the cool things that happened is something called the 7 minutes of terror. And this is the 7 minutes from when the spacecraft that's called the cruise stage enters into the Martian atmosphere. And at that point, the engineers at NASA will switch over from controlling it themselves to just letting the automatic systems take over. So it's kind of terrifying that they just hope that they wrote all their code correctly and they got it all together because they have no control at that point. So this is a graphic that shows us kind of over those 7 minutes, all of the different things that happened from when the cruise stage separates to when it's entering into the atmosphere to when it's slowing down as it enters the atmosphere. The heat shield protects everything that's inside from burning up in the atmosphere. It deployed a very special parachute that then slowed it down further. The heat shield separated, and then as soon as that happened and the rover itself tucked inside of that capsule-like thing, then had what's called terrain relative navigation. So it was able to actually lock onto the planet. And then as it was coming down, it was taking pictures and getting a bunch of data, comparing that to files on board for where it thinks it's supposed to be, and then making sure that it avoids any major large rocks or big holes or anything like that on the ground. And then the final maneuver is the powered descent, where the rockets fire on the jetpack, and then it's lowered down by a sky crane, and then the jetpack then flies away. And that sky crane is really my favorite part of this whole thing. Like, I really just want to be in the room from when they were talking about, like, how do we land on Mars this next time? We've tried the big inflatable balloon where it, like, basically some of the earlier ones in the early 2000s had landed by inflating big airbags, and they crash onto the surface and they just kind of bounce along in these big balloons. And then they were like, well, what are we going to do next? And then someone was like, okay, guys, hear me out. I got an idea. It's called a sky crane. And it blows my mind that it worked. It's amazing. So for the first time ever, we actually have a video of Perseverance landing. Previous Martian rovers had like kind of some time lapse or some images that they took along the way, but we've actually got some video of the landing. So we're going to switch over and we're just going to watch that really quick. It's just about 3 minutes long, and then we'll come back together again. So if you haven't seen this yet, it's pretty amazing. So check it out.
We are starting the straighten up and fly right maneuver, where the spacecraft will jettison the entry balance masses in preparation for parachute deploy and to roll over to give the radar a better look at the ground.
Indicate chute deploy.
The navigation has confirmed that the parachute has deployed, and we are seeing significant deceleration in the velocity. Our current velocity is 440 meters per second at an altitude of about 12 kilometers from the surface of Mars.
Heat shield set.
Perseverance is now slowed to subsonic speeds, and the heat shield has been separated. This allows both the radar and the cameras to get their first look at the surface. Current velocity is 145 meters per second at an altitude of about 9.5 kilometers above the surface.
Nav filter converge. Velocity solution 3.3 meters per second. Altitude 7.4 kilometers.
Now has radar lock on the ground. Current velocity is about 100 meters per second, 6.6 kilometers above the surface of Mars. Perseverance is continuing to descend on the parachute. We are coming up on the initialization of terrain relative navigation and subsequently the priming of the landing engines. Our current velocity is about 90 meters per second at an altitude of 4.2 kilometers.
OVS valid.
We have confirmation that the lander vision system has produced a valid solution and part of terrain relative navigation.
Priming.
TBA is nominal.
We have priming of the landing engines.
Back shell set.
Current velocity is 83 meters per second at about 2.6 kilometers from the surface of Mars. We have confirmation that the back shell has separated. We are currently performing the divert maneuver. Current velocity is about 75 meters per second at an altitude of about a kilometer off the surface of Mars.
TRN Safety Bravo.
We have completed our terrain relative navigation. Current speed is about 30 meters per second, altitude of about 300 meters off the surface of Mars. We have started our constant velocity accordion, which means we are conducting the sky crane, about to conduct the sky crane maneuver. Sky crane maneuver has started.
We're getting signals from MRO.
Tango Delta.
Touchdown confirmed. Perseverance safely on the surface of Mars, ready to begin seeking the sands of past life.
All right, I just love that every single time. So let's talk just a little bit about what just happened. So this is an image that was taken by the high-rise. Sorry, you can maybe hear my 9-month-old in the background. There's a satellite called the Mars Reconnaissance Rover that has a camera on it called high-rise. So it takes a lot of really high-def images of the surface of Mars, and it's really awesome. And one of the things that it captured as Perseverance was coming down was this tiny little pixel dot right in here in the middle of that small square. And then this is it zoomed up there on the right side, where you can see the parachute and then the descent stage down below it. And then that little circle below that is where Perseverance ended up landing. And then over on the right-hand side, you can see the outline of the river delta, or the ancient river delta that, like, it's like 2 billion years or something like that. This area that it landed was covered with water. It was a lake. And then this is where the river that came in with flowing water washed a whole bunch of sediment into this part of that crater. So that's why they're landing there, because the primary mission is to search for signs of ancient life. And this is a really good place to do it, someplace where we know that there used to be flowing water. So one of the cool things that's happening with this mission is it's going to be collecting samples and caching them in these tubes and then leaving them on the surface with geoposition tags. And then there's a future mission somewhere down the line that's going to go land on Mars near these things, send out a little rover to go pick them up, bring them back to that lander that's going to shoot them up into space, where they'll rendezvous with a orbiting satellite that will then detach something else to bring them back to Earth. So that's probably sometime in like the 2030s that's going to happen. So it's going to be quite a while, but it's still part of this mission because the rovers can only determine so much, and they're really, really slow. So if they find something that seems interesting, they can put those samples into those capsules and then get those sent back to Earth for later study by people with much better technology and things here on Earth. There's also a couple of technology demonstrations that are going to happen that are not really part of doing anything other than to see if they can do it. And one of those is this thing, which is called Ingenuity, and it's a helicopter about the size of a large drone that's going to do the first powered flight on another planet. So sometime in the next couple of weeks to a month, they expect to try a couple of test flights with this thing, which is, again, at this point, just to kind of see if they can. And then in the future, they may try to use these to sort of scout ahead of the rovers to figure out where they're going to go, because they can move a lot faster than the rovers can over the ground where they're dealing with boulders and stuff. And then the other technology demonstration is there's an instrument called MOXIE, which is an acronym for something. It's going to take the carbon dioxide in Mars's atmosphere and turn it into oxygen, which can be used for people to breathe at some point in the future on Mars if we manage to get people there, but can also be used as rocket fuel at some point too. So there's a lot of really, really cool things that are happening with this mission. And then you gotta love NASA because they're full of nerds and they're really into the details. And this is a parachute. So this is looking up at the parachute. And somebody online cracked the code that this design of the parachute is not just random. It actually spells out in binary between these couple of different panels shown here, dare mighty things. And then around the outside, it has the GPS coordinates of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Southern California. So they look like they're just kind of random places, but when you kind of look at the patterns, you can figure out that it's a little bit more than that. So that was one of the coolest details of this landing, that somebody figured that out. This is also a plate that's on the side of it. That is a family portrait, like you see a lot of people with on their cars, with all the different Mars rovers. So you had Pathfinder in the 90s, and then Spirit and Opportunity in the early 2000s. Curiosity landed in 2012, and then we have Perseverance and Ingenuity that just landed pretty recently. All right, now before I turn it over to our speakers, we're going to take just a couple minutes to play this really quick game about Mars. So one of the things that we can learn about Mars is by studying things that are here on Earth as well. So we're going to skip through some of these because there's a lot of them. We want to get to our other presenters, but I'm excited about Mars, so we're going to talk about this really quick. So this is going to take a look at some different features both on Earth and on Mars, and it's going to ask you some questions. So for example, these are clouds on Mars. So these things on the right side, those are some clouds on the surface of Mars. And then these are two satellite images of Earth. So what you're going to do is in the chat, you're going to write either A or B. Which one do you think is pictures of clouds? Is it A, this picture here, or is it B, this picture down here? Okay, sorry, I know that little box is blocking the view for you guys, but that just shows me that y'all are answering the question. All right, cool. So this is A. These are clouds over the US East Coast. Clouds on Mars are made of A, water, B, carbon dioxide, or C, water and carbon dioxide. So you can put that in the chat again. Clouds on Mars are made of C, water and carbon dioxide. This is one of the ice caps here on Earth, Antarctica. Which of those two features on Mars is an ice cap on that planet, A or B? All right, this one's kind of a trick question because they are both ice caps on Mars. This one is the southern ice cap, and this one is the northern ice cap. And we're going to skip this one. The northern ice cap on Mars consists of frozen water and carbon dioxide, and it's seasonal because sometimes it's facing too close to the sun or too much direct sunlight for it to stay that way. So this is just a quick graphic that shows how the polar ice cap, the northern polar ice cap on Mars changes over several years here on Earth because the orbit of Mars is a lot bigger than Earth. It takes longer, so the seasons are a lot longer, so they span a lot bigger time. We'll skip that one. True, dust storms on Mars can cover the entire planet. This is a dust devil on Earth. And which of these is a dust devil on Mars? Is it A or B? The answer is both. Both of those are on Mars. So A is seen from the ground by the Opportunity rover, and B is seen from above by the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. Okay, these are not the little Star Trek symbol. These are some dunes, which is actually, this is on Mars, the Mars region on Mars. It got cut off, sorry. Which of these are dunes on Earth, A or B? Answer is A, in the Sahara Desert. So we see a lot of really, really similar features both on Mars and on Earth, because there is a thin atmosphere on Mars, so there is wind blowing around and a whole lot of sand, so we can see both of them. Which of these is a impact crater on Mars, A or B? The correct answer for this one is B. It's a little crater on Mars. The other one was a volcano. Okay, this one is of interest because this is River Delta in Jezero Crater where Perseverance just touched down. So which of these two features on Earth is a river delta, A or B? Being in Hawaii, I would hope that some of you might actually get this one, because you might recognize that top one. B, the Horton River Delta in Canada. So you can see the river coming out here and then spreading all of this sediment out into this body of water beyond it. So very similar thing happened here at the River Delta in Jezero Crater. Okay, we're gonna kind of skip through some of these other ones. Okay, this is a shield volcano. This is actually Mauna Loa. I'm not sure why it says Mauna Kea. I actually borrowed this set of slides from somebody else. And I guess that I didn't look closely enough, so sorry about that. This is actually Mauna Loa and not Mauna Kea. Which of those two on the right is also a massive shield volcano, A or B? Yeah, I kind of gave the answer away to that one when I said it earlier. That is Olympus Mons, the largest volcano in the solar system. Yeah, so just answer that. It's taller than both of those. It's about 14 miles high from base to summit. So Everest is about 5.5 miles, and Mauna Kea, as measured from, this time it does mean Mauna Kea, is measured from the sea floor all the way up to the summit is 6.3 miles. That same volcano, Olympus Mons, is as big as the state of Arizona, and is also as wide as all of the islands of Hawaii put together. All right, and we'll end on this one because this one's really cool. This is what's called a rift or a graben. So this is a place where the crust has kind of split apart, and it's called Valles Marineris. It's on Mars. Which of these two is the similar feature on Earth? Is it A or B? And the answer is B. These are grabens in the Afar region of Ethiopia. So in Eastern Africa, it's actually splitting apart right along where you can see all of the lakes, where you have Lake Victoria, Lake Tanganyika, other ones like that. They're all, it's lakes there because it's lower and it's splitting apart over time. So eventually that will turn into a new ocean basin very similar to the Atlantic. Okay, how long is Valles Marineris? As long as the Florida Panhandle, as long as the Rio Grande River, or as long as the width of the United States? Seen a lot of C's in the chat there. Yes, that is correct. It is as long as the United States. It's very, very large, about 2,500 miles from one end to the other. All right, so we are going to go ahead and we'll stop the game there. I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker. So if you just give us a second to get everything set up, Ethan, if you are ready to go, or if you need a minute, then we'll take just a second to switch that over. So thanks everyone for playing along and for learning about Mars. We'll talk more about it at that Stars Tonight on Saturday, this coming Saturday the 6th for that planetarium program. So check out the museum website for that. Okay, and without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Ethan Estess. Thanks, Ethan.
Thanks, Tony. Can everybody hear me? I'll take that as a yes.
Yes.
All right. And let's share screens. And let's get started. Thank you all for having me. I'm a guest at the Bishop Museum. I'm an artist and scientist. I work independently, but I'm lucky to have this sculpture, which we call the plastic-free pipeline, on display at the museum as part of the Mai Kanohi Mai exhibit on surfing. And the idea behind this piece, Mai Kanohi Mai is looking at the history of surfing in Hawaii, but this piece is a statement about the potential future of what surfing could look like in Hawaii. And even at sometimes it's what it looks like now. On the windward shores of the islands, this material is accumulating. It washes in from all around the Pacific, and it's unfortunately, it's very harmful for wildlife, and it's a major problem that our society is facing. So my artwork focuses on this issue of plastic pollution, but my research is kind of separate. It's more focused on tunas and sharks. And today I'm just going to kind of quickly go through my journey through multiple disciplines as a nerd in both of them, and kind of share that story with you. I couldn't resist. I had to throw this in there when I saw Tony was going deep into Mars, and it's all right. I've been. It's okay. There's no surf. A lot of rocks. I'm personally strongly prefer Earth. But I made this jumpsuit and had a motorcycle helmet, and this is in the Canary Islands, which are kind of the Atlantic version of the Hawaiian Islands. And this island is called Lanzarote, and it's where they film a lot of Mars movies. I couldn't help myself. I had to do a stunt. My connection with the Bishop Museum goes a bit farther back. I've all roads lead to the Bishop Museum, really. I've been lucky to sail 2 times from Tahiti to Hawaii, different courses through the Marquesas and Tuamotus and the Line Islands, but on an oceanographic research vessel that happens to be a big sailboat. And the more I dug into the history of that journey, like I said, really all the resources were coming from the Bishop Museum and the collection there. One experience I had that was really special was Herb Kane is a really famous Hawaiian painter, and has done a lot of work with the Bishop Museum. And when we sailed in to Kapalikū Bay in 2009, after like 19 days on the open ocean, Herb met us under a tree, and he was very old, and but he is so cool, and he told us these great stories about the history of Hawaii, and about Captain Cook, who in that space was just such a powerful experience to learn from such a wise person. So anyway, that's my kind of connection to the museum before, and so that's why I'm so excited to be able to show my work there now. I believe that art is a powerful tool for getting people to change and think critically, and that's kind of my core belief, that we can change the world through something that seems simple, like art. But I think it works because it creates an emotional connection. Whereas I think as scientists, we often focus on communicating hard numbers and solid statistics. But there has to be another piece that gets people to think and feel. So I think that humans are very visual, and we internalize things that we see maybe in a way, sometimes more than things we hear. Or a combination is good too, but I think that's hardwired into us. So art can tap into that, and get people to care. The reason I care about the ocean and about these issues is that I grew up surfing and making surfboards in Santa Cruz, California, where I am now. And basically, I did a little art, but not much. But surfing in Santa Cruz is really, you definitely are aware of what's swimming around you. And we have a very healthy population of great white sharks. If you have a cold beverage, you can see that this shark has some jewelry on its back. And if you know what it is, you can type it in the chat. And if you're correct, you should just have a sip of that beverage and reward yourself. So this is a large great white shark that has been tagged. The answer is those are electronic trackers. And this is, my fear of sharks really transitioned to interest. And so I went to college and worked with this laboratory at Stanford University that studies great white sharks and other species. So if you put these trackers on these fish, they swim from California. Actually, some of them actually come out to the Hawaiian archipelago. Most of them come to an area about halfway between Hawaii and Baja. And we call that the Great White Shark Cafe. It's called a cafe because it's kind of still unknown what it represents in the white shark life history. You could be on a date at a cafe, or you could just be getting a snack. The reality is probably both for these sharks. Other people call it Burning Man for sharks because they all go out into the middle of the desert basically and party. There's really nothing going on out here oceanographically speaking. It's a very non-productive part of the ocean. So it's a total mystery. And that is what really hooked me into this field. When you do what this group did, I was part of this, but only a very small part. This group called the project was called Tagging of Pacific Pelagics. Pelagics are open ocean fish and animals. So here we've got tunas and sharks and turtles and albatross, whales, all these different species represented by all of these GPS, not necessarily GPS locations, so all of these different geolocations. And we call these spaghetti charts because they're all these just interwoven tracks. And you realize that when you look at the ocean, maybe there's some waves, it's pretty, but there's just so much more going on beneath the surface. There's these super highways of animals utilizing these habitats. So while I was doing that work in college, I was also taking art classes on the side. I started getting into making sculptures that were trying to communicate some of the things I was learning in environmental science. And this was a sculpture that talked about pesticide pollution of the California brown pelican population and how they, were in decline and then recovered through grassroots activism. And so that's been kind of a trend for me, is just starting to learn to tell stories. When I was finishing college, I got this residency position at the San Francisco landfill. And so I got to pick through the trash, and one day I found a bunch of styrofoam and some old glue, and I glued it up onto a piece of wood. I shaped it like I would a surfboard, and then I wrapped it in a bunch of rope that I found. And I actually got really lucky. I got to display that sculpture at the San Francisco International Airport. That was kind of a really cool first experience for me, and kind of communicating to a large audience through art about an issue about that I learned about in my work as a marine biologist. So it was a really cool first successful sculpture. I ended up getting a job. I really just wanted to make art when I finished college, but I got a job at this laboratory that is run by the Monterey Bay Aquarium and Stanford University. And basically it's like, we call it the tuna lab. This right here is, for example, is like a treadmill for it's a yellowfin tuna. And we put them in there, we get them happy, seal them in, and you can measure their respiratory rate over time and understand their energetic needs. And they're incredible animals. So we study their physiology in the lab, but then we go into the wild, and it's a really fun job because you got to catch them. So sometimes these large Atlantic bluefin will take a couple hours to catch, and they're tired. So we irrigate their gills with a seawater hose, and quickly, it takes less than a minute, tag them and release them with the electronic trackers. And the trackers, again, show you where they go and what they do. We release these giant bluefin. Some of them are up to 1,400 pounds, and they swim from Canada all the way down into the Gulf of Mexico, where they spawn, and then they swim right back up to feed up in the productive waters off Nova Scotia. So that work is really cool, and we're all high-fiving each other because we're doing conservation science, and it's cool. And we come back to the dock, and there's just dead fish everywhere. They're all getting boxed up and shipped overnight to Japan. And it's kind of like the sobering reality that you're studying a fish that is also being eaten into decline. And so that was kind of triggered this feeling that I needed to speak to this issue, because I was lucky to see these animals alive, which many people aren't. Most people see tuna on a plate. And I wanted to kind of reference how beautiful they are, and how also they're this crazy global commodity that gets shipped around the world. So I made this diamond encrusted bluefin that's 8 feet long. They're not real diamonds, but it was about 50,000 rhinestones that I put on there, glued on one at a time. And I started trying to use my art skills and experience to communicate more about the issues I was learning about with tuna at this time. And I kind of started to take art more seriously. I kind of set up a studio in Santa Cruz and a gallery, and I was still continuing to work part-time, kind of 1 foot in science, 1 foot in the art. And this is pretty much what I'm doing today, is balancing those. This is like my kit. I got this gig in Japan, where we are collaborating with the Japanese government to tag and release baby bluefin tunas. This is like a little, 1 pounder. We're going to put this electronic track. I'm cutting him open, and we're going to stitch him back up. But he's going to have a little bit of hardware in his tummy. And this guy will swim across the Pacific from Japan to California in about a month and a half total duration. It's about 6,000 miles. And we also are tagging the larger fish, the adults or subadults, with a pop-up satellite tracker. And so we're working with our Japanese colleagues to release them, and with commercial fishermen, and we're getting some really great data. This is a fish that was actually tagged in California, but you can see that they just do this incredible migration all the way across the Pacific. And they'll do that a couple times throughout their life, back and forth. One of the things about spending much of time in fishing villages is that there's not always a lot to do. And my Japanese isn't very good. This is actually Canada, I realized. But anyway, so I like to pick through the trash, and I really like rope. So I started making art out of this rope, and based on some of the traditional Japanese patterns I had been exposed to. And, I started making more and more of this work. This is kind of how I make my living now, is mostly selling this type of work. And that's been kind of a crazy experience, just, going from an idea to making a career out of selling trash. So it's been kind of interesting. But, the more commercial my work kind of became, I realized that I need to kind of do more to give back. And I was lucky to participate in the March for Science in 2016. And it really inspired me to start a nonprofit that focuses on science communication. So my org is called Countercurrent, and we've made some large installations that are interactive and get people excited about science, get people excited about environmental issues. And the plastic-free pipeline, there's also a lot of evidence that art is crazy. Sorry. The plastic-free pipeline came out of my org, Countercurrent, and my work, some friends at a group called Sustainable Coastlines Hawaii. as well as the Kokua Hawaii Foundation. Also, it was supported by Turtle Bay Resort and Reuse Hawaii in Honolulu. So I got all this wood from Reuse down in town, and it was all like rotten plywood, but I made like a giant skate ramp structure. And then working with volunteers through Sustainable Coastlines Hawaii, we collected all this material and untangled it, which was the hardest part. And we built this thing in Jack Johnson's driveway up on the North Shore. And it took me like 3 weeks to build it, full speed. And then we installed it at the at Ehukai Beach Park for the Pipe Masters contest, and just in time. And it was like really fun to have it in the park there. People could take pictures. There's like a social media campaign with it, and millions of people saw it online through that. And it traveled to Turtle Bay Resort after that, then Sharks Cove, and then finally to the Bishop Museum. And that piece was really about educating people about where this debris comes from. A lot of this is commercial fishing gear that is connected to tuna fisheries that are operated by foreign fleets, but the debris is left behind and it drifts all the way to Hawaii. So it really is good to know your fishermen and eat, sustainably caught, line caught tuna, as opposed to these other fisheries that leave all this waste behind. And I made another piece kind of inspired by that one through Countercurrent that is made of about 20,000 golf balls that a local teenager collected out of the ocean here in California. And that one lives on a trailer so it can tour around. And hopefully the real gist of this talk is that I've been lucky enough to kind of have multiple passions, and I've been able to kind of pursue them both at the same time. And I hope that other people can find that and not have to sacrifice one passion for the other. That's like, I think there's a synergy that can happen when you combine the things you love. And that's what I hope people are able to keep going with all of their different passions. I'm really, really lucky to work with a lot of great orgs, and definitely check out these groups. On island, you got Sustainable Coastlines Hawaii and Kokua Hawaii Foundation, also Surfrider Foundation chapters, and Parlay for the Oceans is also in Hawaii. There's tons of good stuff going on out there. And I'm looking forward to the science and sustainability events. I'll be doing a live printmaking activity there, and decommissioning the pipeline sculpture to upcycle it into little pieces of art that I'm going to donate to the 8 public schools on the North Shore. And that is my talk. And I look forward to seeing you at Science and Sustainability Night.
Woo!
Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Ethan. And before I forget, there was a question. All right. So hopefully everyone got yourselves a new drink if you were done, or you're ready for something else. What have you got going on? So we are ready now for our next talk. So I would like to introduce Kapalikū Maile, who is going to tell us all about the new exhibit at Bishop Museum and some of what it's all about. So take it away, Kapalikū.
Hello, folks. Good evening. I'm going to attempt to share my screen now in a way that I can also see my notes. So hang in there. All right. So thanks for that introduction, Tony. So my name is Kapalikū Maile. I am another educator at the Brittany Spaulding Bishop Museum. And tonight I have the opportunity to talk to you folks a little bit about one of our newest original exhibits, which focuses on the life and legacy of Kanaka Hawaii, of Hawaiian people, as told through the perspectives of something called the Sullivan Collection, but also through the perspectives of the Ohana, the families who continue today to look at the Sullivan Collection in new ways that provides life and gives us opportunities to connect with community at Bishop Museum. So Regenerations, Challenging Racism, Connecting Ohana is the name of my talk. It's not the name of the exhibit, so I'll skip ahead. So as you can tell from the logo, there's already a particular feeling that you might get from coming into this exhibit. I am going to apologize too. I'm going to do my best to keep track of the chat, although I'm also going to try to focus on the presentation at hand. So in case you folks are wondering, Regenerations has already opened as of February 20th and will go all the way to October 24th. And it will be in the Long Gallery. So for those of you who have been to Bishop Museum, the Long Gallery is just on the right when you enter into the Hawaiian Hall building.
Kapalikū, sorry to interrupt you. You have a few things on your screen that are blocking part of our view of.
Oh.
On the right side, there's a long black rectangle, and then there's something kind of in the middle at the top too.
Apologies, those are my notes. So let me try to address that. Okay, can everybody see just the screen again? Is that working better for anybody?
Still see the black bars.
Black bars. It's probably all of your faces from Zoom. Is that any better?
Yeah, that looks good. I think we can see
okay.
the whole slide now.
Sorry about that, folks. In spite of having been in virtual mode for almost a year, I'm still learning things. So again, I'll try to keep track of chat as possible, but I'm going to try to focus also on the presentation at hand, sans my notes. But in any case, I do also want to recognize that this exhibit would not be possible without the family members who gave their consent for the museum to actually talk about their kupuna, their ancestors. And so we'll have a chance to be introduced to those family members a little bit later in this short presentation. But I'd also like to acknowledge the curators for the exhibit, two of whom are actually on this call, if I saw correctly from the participants. I want to recognize Leah Caldera, who is the director of our Bishop Museum's Library and Archives and a curator at the Bishop Museum for Cultural Resiliency, and also Dr. Jillian Swift, who's our curator for archaeology. If you're on this call, hey, Leah, hey, Jillian. I'm not going to be able to be as eloquent as the two of you, and especially Jillian, thank you for helping out with our staffing this morning, but I'm going to try my best. And so they, along with Dr. Keolu Fox, helped to curate this exhibit, which again brings to light something called the Sullivan Collection, and we'll get into a little bit more about Mr. Sullivan himself. But as you can see from this, the exhibit was intended to do a couple things at the same time. Part of that was to deal with a collection that not a whole lot of people probably were familiar with that was housed at Bishop Museum. In fact, let me ask a quick question. Back up for a second. Tony did a great job introducing Bishop Museum, but I wanted to ask, and you folks can put it in the chat, Bishop Museum staff and docents and associated friends and family, I'm going to ask you guys not to answer this question, but for those of you who do not currently work or have worked at Bishop Museum, can anybody in the chat name a collection at Bishop Museum besides Sullivan? Any guesses? There's a few. Oh, I don't know if I'm not getting through or just nobody has a guess as to collections at Bishop Museum. Interesting. Okay, some different answers. I like that. And I think for me, this is a great reminder that for folks who are familiar with the museum but don't always have a chance to visit, we do have a lot of things that are on display inside of our signature galleries, and sometimes we have things that are outdoors. But in terms of actual collections, we have specific natural science and cultural collections. And so the things that are part of Regenerations really come out of our ethnology collection and our library archives collection. So I'm seeing some folks are mentioning our ethnology collection, for example, kahili, staffs with feathers, which are chiefly symbols. We have pressed seaweeds, of course. Our botany collections are great. It's one of my favorites. Of course, we have insects as well. Yes, we have a malacology collection, and there's some malacology folks on here. So I won't go too much further into their things because Noreen and Chandra could talk about that. We do have fish. There's collections of many, many kinds. And so at Bishop Museum, for those of you who are familiar, the museum takes care of things that, you know, sort of defy logic in some cases in terms of how did these things end up in Hawaii, but also things that make absolute sense to be in a collection at one of the most important museum institutions in the state, and also in terms of the Pacific itself. But in terms of the Sullivan collection, again, like I mentioned, the Sullivan collection is part of what we think of as cultural collections at the Bishop Museum. And in terms of the collection, It's a focal point for the Regenerations exhibit because of its content, and we'll get into that content in just a second. But I did want to let you folks know that Regenerations is called Regenerations because it is an exhibit that's meant to regenerate understanding, to shed new light on a collection that was used in the past to denigrate and disenfranchise Native Hawaiians and other Pacific peoples in the larger process of what, for a long time was called eugenics, which was a racialized science that really attempted to put white European male power structures at the top of the hierarchy to the denigration, particularly of what we call now BIPOC, people of color, indigenous populations. And so the exhibit looks at a collection that was framed around at what at the time was sort of the value of eugenics to science, but really putting that on its head and making a very bold statement in saying that eugenics, race, these are things that actually have no place in science. These cannot be determined by scientific measurement. But this collection that is housed at Bishop Museum is something that is being used by the descendants of those families who were studied in the process of this to better understand their histories, to look at information that was collected about their ohana and add that to the family story that they can now share. So I'm going to keep moving forward. So my presentation talks about a couple of different aspects of the exhibit. It's not presented in a way that you actually experience the exhibit. For those of you who may have been in the Long Gallery before, you kind of walk in. The picture on the right-hand side actually shows the entry from the Hawaiian Hall point of view. So you can sort of see on that big picture to the right, if you look kind of in the center of it, those two big wooden doors, that's actually the front doors of the Hawaiian Hall complex. And as you walk into the Long Gallery, you're sort of greeted by this exhibit. But what I wanted to point out is these are some of the parts of the exhibit that most people will see first because it's right there and it sort of confronts you. And this particular table has quite a few things on it that some people may not be familiar with. If we were thinking about drinking games and I was feeling really glib, one thought might be for tonight is every time you see something racist on the screen, take a drink. Now, I say that jokingly, but at the same time, in terms of what is discussed in this exhibit, this table is full of things that were used to attempt to scientifically determine really the value and importance of, again, a white power structure. So I would agree. I'm seeing some of the things in the chat. Now, of course, I want to balance that with the fact that, the legacy of racism, particularly in places like Hawaii, may not seem as obvious as it is in other parts of the world. But there's some things that are shared in this exhibit that really, really hit home, especially for those of us who have lived or grown up here in Hawaii, that, are not necessarily shared in common discourse about history. But what I wanted to also point out with this table is the exhibit itself is a combination of things that come from collections, things that have been put on loan, and also things that were fabricated to be, visual props, physical props to help tell some of these stories. And for those of you who have done museum exhibits or, done posters for a conference, it's important to have visuals along with narrative to explain a story to your audiences. And that's what I'm going to try to do here tonight with these visuals. So what you can see on the right-hand side is this table, and this table greets visitors as they come in. On the left-hand side, you'll see a very interesting looking bust. And what I'm going to do now is zoom in on that. For those of you who can now better see what's written on this particular head, representing a human head, are any of those qualities ones that sort of might surprise you to learn that that's where they are? Constructiveness, acquisitiveness, order. I would not have guessed that all these things reside here in this part of my skull. And that's because they don't. This is a model of a tool that was used during a period in the 20th century to try to ascertain where these aspects of the human mind existed. But they were also used in conjunction with something called anthropometry, which is the measurement of human beings. And that is something that is directly tied to eugenics. And so eugenics, please correct me if I'm wrong, is this idea, sorry, that's Leia and Jillian, is this idea that, there's good things about certain genes, about certain physical traits. And the point of this being is that there was a period in science where eugenics was considered legitimate science. That period has ended, and I don't think anybody on this call, didn't miss that news bulletin. But for a long time, particularly in the United States, this was considered legitimate science. And in the spirit of legitimizing that science, good creation. Thank you, Jillian. Appreciate that. In the spirit of legitimizing that science, all kinds of experiments and pseudoscientific things were carried out at the behest of, again, white, American, European anthropologists and other scientists who were essentially trying to classify human beings by race. So if you've heard the terms, Mongoloid, Negroid, Caucasoid, these are things that come out of that kind of pseudoscience, those kinds of studies. And particularly the idea that at the top of a racial hierarchy is whiteness, and at the bottom is everything else. But there are gradations that put you closer to that ideal. And of course, we know that this is all not scientifically fact. There is nothing scientifically factual about race or eugenics. Right. So seeing a model like this, again, is sort of funny now. We can look at it and we can laugh because of how ridiculous it seems. But these were the kinds of things that also influence policy, and they still have legacies in places like Hawaii today in terms of how people view themselves or how certain communities are viewed in the larger scope of different ethnic backgrounds, different peoples, and particularly the politics and the economics and society that come into play. So in terms of this person named Sullivan, Louis Sullivan was an anthropologist who was working in the Pacific and particularly in Hawaii in the early part of the 20th century. And he was employed by the Bishop Museum and the American Natural History Museum. And during the 1920s, part of his work was to catalog Pacific Island peoples, oceanic peoples, in terms of, what is the race? What is the race of Tonga? What is the race of the Marquesas? What is the race of folks in the Austral Islands? And what is the Hawaiian race? And so when you hear this term in some parts of the world, there's a thought like, okay, white, black, everything else in between. But at that time, particularly, this sense of race was also being, it comes from a legacy of also comparing human beings to things that are not like human beings, animals and other forms of life. Or what in some indigenous communities, we really call our non-human family. And in Hawaii, we have very particular stories about aumakua or akua, so supernatural beings, deities, who are family members. And it has nothing to do with them being non-human in appearance or form or function. It has everything to do with them being ohana. But these kinds of things were not of interest to Sullivan and his ilk. What was of interest to them was of measuring human beings in ways that would, objectify and subject them to classes. And the idea was to create racial types that would then measure up against this sense of what is at the highest point, which would be whiteness, and what would it be at the lowest point. I did want to mention that this book, Essentials of Anthropometry, is a manual that he created, and all of the tools that were represented on that table that we just saw are things that are mentioned as essential to the measurement of human beings and the classification of them based on this sense of anthropometry and physical anthropology. And for a long time, this was a very popular sort of branch of science, and again, especially in the United States, and it was used very insidiously to the denigration of African Americans, to the denigration of brown people, and anybody who basically was not white. And I would mention that, again, these are legacies that continue even today in the United States and in parts of Europe. And I will mention, and we do talk about this in the exhibit, that eugenics begins in the United States and then migrates to places in Europe. And it especially takes hold in Germany. And so some of the eugenic thoughts that are developed in the States provide a basis for what eventually later becomes the mindset of Nazi Germany. And so if you're interested in hearing a little bit more about that, I would say, along with all these things, please come and see the exhibit, because it is something that is meant to be experienced. And a presentation like this will give you a little bit of it, but it's something that I think all of us at the museum would say, you got to come and see it to get the full effect. To go back to that table, I did want to point out some of the other things that are there, which I think are really useful in terms of talking about how anthropometry, this idea of measuring people, was such a big deal. If you've got the Ujis yet, don't worry, it doesn't get a whole lot worse than this. But if you notice on the left-hand side, there is a replica of a human head, and it is actually not in a torture device. For a bonus point, does anybody know what this device is called and what its purpose is? Any guesses, folks? This is not one that I would know, but maybe some of you folks are familiar with it. Okay, lobotomy is a decent guess, but it's not lobotomy. Although that was something that was also used to the detriment of people of color, and particularly folks who suffered from different kinds of serious mental illness, right? Ah, very good. So we're getting closer. It's a cephalometer. Thank you, Cheyenne, who is one of our exhibit techs at the Bishop Museum. So this was used to measure parts of the cranium, parts of the skull. And again, these measurements were used to say, if your head is this wide, your brows are this wide, there's certain distances, you of a certain race belong in certain categories of intelligence. So while this does look like a torture device and something you would probably see in a horror movie now, this is something that was actually used scientifically to measure the intelligence and the worth of human beings. And there are calipers on that table. There are other tools that were used for measurement that were meant to be scientific. And those objective measurements were then used to influence policy that, you know, again, there's a legacy of these things in the United States and Hawaii today in terms of how people of color, indigenous populations are treated based on hierarchies that come right out of eugenics. Yes, and so what I would mention is, like I said, things that are borrowed for this exhibit are on display, but things like this cephalometer and the eyes, for example, that you can see there on the bottom right-hand corner. I'll make sure the chat is close so you folks can see it. These are things that are a combination of things that were borrowed, but also fabricated by our exhibit staff, but based on actual tools that were used by eugenicists and folks who were interested in racial science at that time as reference points for how close to whiteness you were. And sorry, I'm just gonna say it. If you're as grossed out as I am at seeing some of these things and talking about these things, you're in the right spot. But in terms of moving forward from this, I do wanna mention that one of the aspects of the Sullivan collection at the Bishop Museum that is very particular, but also has yielded very important conversations, is this idea that the Sullivan collection is all made up of things that Sullivan created to put forward this research. And part of it were black and white photographs. A great part of it were black and white photographs of Native Hawaiian families here in Hawaii, but also a collection of more than 50 plaster busts. And these are 3 that are on display inside the exhibit. And they are of Edward A. Choi, Mamane Keawemauhili, and William Chang Poka. Now, out of curiosity, if I were to ask you folks here, how old do you think the people depicted in these busts are? What would you say? Any guesses? Okay. I see 80, I see 25. See if we can get a few more 20s, 20. Okay. So these busts were done of young men who were students at Kamehameha schools while Sullivan was doing some of his research. So these are not old men. These are not men. These are younger folks. But the perception that's being created in these particular busts is, oh yeah, these are, you know, full-grown men. But their stories are part of the Sullivan Collection's legacy. And all of these gentlemen and more had busts made of them because they were considered to be exemplary students at Kamehameha schools, which I would like to mention very specifically because this is not something that I knew about as an alumnus or as a student at Kamehameha schools, of which I'm a graduate, class of 2005, is eugenics was actually taught in curriculum at the Kamehameha schools in the early part of the 20th century. We are not that far away from that legacy of these things being taught in school as legitimate science. And particularly, it is a scary thought to think that Native Hawaiian young men and women were being taught these kinds of things as if it was normal and as if it was correct. Now, again, these are not things that are taught in the DOE system here in Hawaii anymore, but there are still legacies of understanding sort of how people fit into a racialized hierarchy that exists in Hawaii today. But I did want to mention that these busts and the rest of them that are part of this collection are still things that are of importance to the descendant families that connect to these particular objects. So for this exhibit, the curators worked really hard to try to get in touch with the living family members of Edward Achoy, Mamani Kiawe Mauhili, and William Cheng Po Ka. Unfortunately, we were not able to contact them in terms of creating this for the exhibit, but there are records within the last, say, decade or so that the curators were able to find and research that allowed us to know that descendant family members had come to find these things and be with their kupuna in this way. And so it's one of those interesting sort of points of consequence for the Sullivan collection in terms of the descendant family communities being able to connect and link up to things that at a time were being used for purposes that either there was no, there was really not informed consent given, and the intentions of these collections and the research were very much contra to what anybody would have wanted at the period. But I'm going to keep moving because there's a few more things to show. And yes, I'll mention another person, Kamalu Dupreez, did some research. She's another member of our ethnology staff. She's our assistant collections manager at the Bishop Museum. And she did research to, as Jillian said, connect with these descendants. So again, like I mentioned, eugenics was something that was taught as legitimate science in schools in Hawaii. And there were laws that related to eugenics that were on the books in the territorial period in Hawaii. And so that's a reminder, we're really not far away from this history. And so this exhibit, again, does a lot of things, and it attempts to reconcile, well, not reconcile, but attempts to reckon with the history that these studies and all of this has here in Hawaii, which a lot of people assume is just, yeah, it's the mixing pot, it's the stew. There's a lot more to it than that. And these are some of the stories that are not actually well told or well known today by the people who are in my generation. And so it's important for us to help tell some of these stories. So I wanted to show this because of the desire to want to share a little bit about the 3 students who were used as models for those busts. And of course, there are many more. But what the curators really try to do with this exhibit is whenever depictions of Kanaka or other people were put into this exhibit, whether it was a bust or photograph, there was the most tremendous amount of detail put to not only presenting their names, but trying to present a story. And so when you go to this exhibit and you see these 3 busts of these former students of Kamehameha schools, this plinth has other sort of graphic textual panels like this one that actually tell stories about them. And so one of the really significant parts of this exhibit is it's meant to be biographical in that way. It's not meant to just show pictures as if it was a gallery. It's meant to really help tell stories of these Kanaka Hawaii, as of these Hawaiians as people who were living, breathing human beings who especially at this time, will never be stripped of their humanity through the processes that Sullivan and others tried to put in place. So as a reminder, I wanted to throw this slide in here too, to let folks know that Bishop Museum does have historical collections that go back many hundreds of years, but we also try to connect to things that are happening right now. And so when it comes to the recent protests and movement through Black Lives Matter and things that have been happening on the continent, those things also connect to what has been happening here in Hawaii. And so this idea of condemning racism is nothing new, but this history, again, is not far away from where we are now. And it's not hard to see that there's a lot of education that needs to happen in places in very particular parts of the United States that help us all to understand what is right and what is appropriate about learning these things and moving forward together. I wanted to put this statement up here because I feel it's one of the most powerful statements in the exhibit. I'm not going to read all of it, but I did want to read out the first part of it, which is the idea that there is no biological truth to race. Race is an invention of colonialism, but nevertheless, the social, political, and economic realities of racism, prejudice, and social inequality continue to have real consequences. And that is really, for me, not having been one of the curators for this exhibit, sort of the thesis at the heart of this, which is to say, yeah, these things happened. We're moving forward, but we're not trying to forget this, because these are things that help us to have perspective in how we relate to each other, but especially how we understand the treatment of BIPOC communities all over the world. But in Hawaii, particularly, these are the examples that we see. I would also mention in terms of when we think about DNA and data and facts, like it says here, 0.1% of human DNA is different from person to person. And genetic research has also been used, ironically, perhaps for Sullivan folks, to show that we're actually not that different in terms of our DNA and the genetic information that our bodies hold. And so that's a reminder that, you know, between populations, there's really less difference on that level than anybody could imagine. So the idea of race is something that, you know, has no scientific basis. The really important part about this exhibit, again, is not only exploring the Sullivan collection, but also exploring it in terms of the people who are represented in that collection. And when we think about people, we are thinking about the different ohana that Sullivan and his colleagues tried to study. And so we focus on 5 of those ohana in the spaces today. So here's a different view of the long gallery as you walk in. So we can see past the table and we can see along the walls representations of 5 different ohana, 5 different families who their lineal descendants were able to be in touch with the museum, and they have been coming to the museum to do research about their kupuna, their ancestors. And so the museum was able to be in conversation with them and include them and their ancestors in this way, in this particular exhibit. And again, that sense of consent is really strong here. So the museum really wanted to do right by them and represent those stories. And some of the stories that are shared inside the exhibit are really, really important. But I would say that we don't have time to share all of those stories tonight, but I do want to go through and show you a few of these ohana. The way the ohana are represented is a combination of black and white photographs of those ohana members who are represented in the Sullivan collection, documents and stories that pertain to them, but also their living descendants. So if we go between each ohana, we have the ho'olapas and the keles, who are represented here by Ana Maria Aveo Paikai, who is the mama in this picture with her ohana there. We have the Kaleohano and Wentworth Ohana, who are represented by Dean Kayave here. And in the exhibit, one thing that's really neat is for the Kaleohanos and Wentworths, their family continues to celebrate their kupuna of the generation that Sullivan was interested in. And when they have family reunions every couple of years or so, they actually have plaques that represent the different family members. And within those branches of families, the folks that descend from those particular individuals have to take care of these plaques. And when they get together, they tell stories, they relive that history, and they cement their familial bonds together in that way. It was really unique, and they allowed the museum to borrow many of these plaques. So I think if I can, I'll go back real quick. In this initial picture here on the left, these are those plaques. And so they have pictures from the Sullivan collection of those different kupuna. And then the different family branches who are in charge of taking care of those things are the ones that hold on to them during those years in between. So it's a really neat story, and it's something that it's really fantastic that they give permission for the museum to help tell some of that story, because it is something really kind of unique to them, but it helps us to share this really deep connection that living descendants of these Ohanas still have, and how they've been able to use aspects of the Sullivan collection to really their benefit. We have the Duvashels, from whom I've learned that there are many different Ohana related, and there's quite a few Duvashels around still, but they're represented here in particular to the connection that these have to collections by research that Nalani Belutsky, who's represented in this picture here holding the pepe, was doing with the Bishop Museum. We have the Ka'aukai Ohana and their descendant who's been in touch with the museum, who's Nola Dolim. You'll recognize him. He's also I think he's in the PhD program at UH now. He's doing important things. So if you recognize that name, he's a good one to remember. And then we have the Akonas, who were identified as Akona by Sullivan, but up until the 1940s, if I recall correctly, were actually known as Hamauku. And so that's another aspect of the research that Sullivan did that, in terms of revisiting it with the families, has been really valuable for the museum to know that Sullivan didn't get everything right. In fact, some of the stories and names that he recorded were incorrect. And so the museum being in conversation with these descendant families has helped the museum to do better by its record keeping and the information that it maintains and stewards. And we've been able to keep track of these relationships here. And so this is Charnel and Marley Renty Cruz from Kauai, and they were the Ohana that are representing the connection to the Akonas, or the Hamaukus. Okay, so the Ohana are a huge part of this exhibit. talking about the Sullivan collection and the eugenics sort of history that comes with it is a huge part of this exhibit. Another part of the exhibit is exploring modern day genetic studies and genomics. So inside the exhibit, the section is not called Genomics RS. So Leah, Jillian, sorry, that was me for this particular PowerPoint presentation. But in a way, if you go to this table, which is sort of called the futures table, the future table, it's an exploration of the current cutting edge of genetic technology, analysis and measurement, but also a satirical twist on companies that can use your DNA, can use your genetic blueprint to try to tell you about yourself, but also monetize your genetic information. So in terms of this table, what you see here are tools that are used in modern day genetic testing. And what I'll mention is on the picture on the left-hand side, right where it has that panel that says an entire DNA lab in your backpack, there's a handful of very powerful digital tools that really can fit into a backpack. I mean, even the really small ones that some folks have. And you can take that and you can test the genetic information and analyze that information for basically an entire population. It's a combination of a phone and a few other tools, and that's all you need now to get genetic information, analyze it, save it, and record it for whatever purposes you might have. So one of the conversations that we have in this exhibit is this sense of understanding how your genetic information, how your DNA should be used or can be used, and making sure that you're thinking about informed consent. Just out of curiosity, has anybody here done Ancestry or 23andMe, anything like that? Put my hand up because I have. Maybe a few of us, sorry. Unfortunately, I can't see everybody's pictures, so maybe there's some hands up. But what that process does is it takes your information and it compares it to a larger pool of data, right? And so you're looking at sets of information to try to understand, okay, how do I compare it to all these other people? And while I'm not a scientist, my general understanding is if the pool of data is not real big, the information that you're going to get back from it may not be all that representative. So to share a personal example, when my family did 23andMe and I signed up for it, maybe about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, some of the results that I got were taking my family back to Tonga, which is great. That could be a thing. It's not a story that we have in our family in the last few generations. And more recently, the information has now been updated to say Eastern Polynesia and Hawaii. Okay, not too far of a stretch in terms of what could be distant ancestry, but is certainly more recent. When other people take those tests, I've been told their results vary a whole lot more widely based on, again, the populations that are also putting their DNA up for these companies to check out. And so one of the conversations that we want to have in this exhibit is this idea that your genetic information, your DNA represents a part of you, but it doesn't represent all of your story. Your story is represented in your family, your community, your history, your lived experiences. Yes, it is, Chandra. That is right. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward. Because even though it's not part of that particular section, when it comes to DNA and genetic testing, I wanted to introduce this idea that there are some objects in our cultural collections, particularly, that do include human materials. So this portrait is of two people, and if you read it, you might recognize them. If you recognize them right away, even better. This is a portrait of a young Bernice Pauahi Paki, or Bernice Pauahi Bishop, and her Hanai sister, Lydia Kamakaeha, also known as Queen Liliuokalani. So there is a discussion in the exhibit, particularly about Hanai, which is this, this thing that still plays out in the Hawaiian community today, where folks from different biological families or sort of distantly related biological families come together and they are Hanai, they're adopted into another family situation. So even though folks think of Bernice Pauahi Bishop and Queen Liliuokalani may be coming from different generations, they're actually not that far apart in age, and they were raised together as siblings. Now, what we see here on the right-hand side at the top is a selection of jewelry, of earrings, and a wristlet made from human hair. And this comes from human hair of Pauahi's family members. In Hawaiian tradition, human hair, when it's used, is something that isn't used lightly. It's usually associated with the mana of the person that came with it. And there's lots of ways to translate mana, but I'll just leave it as this sense of there is something sort of supernaturally powerful and important. So this hair jewelry carries that, and it would have carried that for Pauahi and Liliuokalani. The style of jewelry comes from a Victorian style that would have been common in places like England. So this is an adaptation to different ideas. It is something that's executed in a way that comes from outside Hawaii, but with an intention of something that comes from very much inside Hawaii. But what you see below it, although I apologize, my picture is not very good, are two examples of what we call leiniho palawa. And leiniho palawa are adornments for chiefs, and the central part of it is made from a carved sperm whale's tooth usually, but the necklace itself is also made of lauaho. It's made out of human hair. And so one of the conversations that this brings up in the exhibit is, what if you were to test these things? What if you were to take genetic information from these cultural objects that have so much significance and have very direct connections to ali'i, who in Hawaiian culture are very much considered to be special and sacred? What are the ethical consequences of that? And if you were to test these things, who is it that could actually give permission? So, this idea of consent is really important, but also do these things cross boundaries? And I think they do. But yes, I'm going to keep moving forward. We do talk about Henrietta Lacks. She has a panel that talks about her history. And for those of you who are not familiar, Henrietta Lacks was an African-American woman whose cells were used without her permission. She was undergoing radium treatment for cervical cancer. And in the process of those treatments, her cells were taken without her consent and without her family's consent. And those cells continued to be used and replicated for scientific and medical experiments for years and years and years. And it's only been recently that those things have more come to the forefront. But her family has never been compensated. And there's never been a stop put on the use of what are now called HeLa cells, so Henrietta Lacks HeLa cells. So part of this exhibit really is the idea of, what are the legacies of scientific research on communities, particularly communities of color, in which informed consent is absent? So when we get to the other side of this table, the futures table, we introduce this thing called the Biocolonialism Trust, which is a fake company. So this is the satire part. And it is a company that can offer you all the information you could ever want to know about yourself and everyone else around you for a price, and explain to you how strong your genes are and what you can do to improve the ones that are not so strong. And you can do so at competitive prices. So I wanted to put this up because this is something that was, in terms of the museum story, it's really kind of funny because this is an example of a really poorly worded consent form. But this is an example of something that, for those of us who are in the iPhone generation, when you scroll past that Apple consent form and you hit yes at the bottom, sometimes these are things you might miss. And so this is a very poorly worded form that's asking for your consent to use your DNA for many different purposes. And fun fact, this was actually looked at by our current legal counsel to poke holes and say, yeah, you could make this worse by adding this or saying this in the text. So this is another part of the exhibit. And again, it's meant to be satire, although we have heard that folks have sort of moved through this part of the exhibit and needed to sort of get a second look at it before they got it. But it's a reminder that this kind of satire reflects a reality, particularly for folks who do not have a sense of what consent really means in terms of these kinds of medical and scientific experiments. Even on the level of, hey, 23andMe, yes, I'll give you my swab. But you compare that to the way that DNA and genetic testing may be used against communities to affect policy. These are interrelated. So these are some of the props that were created. And again, I think on the right-hand side, that DNA in a box prop is really useful because of that tagline, trust us to tell you who you are, because that is what some of the current companies that do DNA testing are really asking of the consumer. So this is a close-up of some of those tools. Again, these can fit in a small backpack or even like a bag you would take to the gym. And this is a consummate DNA lab. I did want to play a quick video for you folks, and I think this is probably where I'm going to end. Well, actually, I'll skip the video, and I'll say if you want to see this video and try the complimentary DNA screening service interactive, you got to come to the exhibit. But to continue forward, I wanted to just mention that particularly this exhibit is a way for the museum to reckon with past collections and legacies that are still present in terms of what we have for documents, what we have for cultural and natural science collections. It's part of the museum's history. And this exhibit is one that attempts to really bring that to the forefront and not shy away from controversy, not shy away from those colonial legacies that have been used to put down people of color, the Native Hawaiian community. But it's also there to challenge this idea of race as something scientific. It's not scientific. it's just like this Indigenous Futures panel is suggesting, is that, you know, there is a value in understanding where we come from and understanding how that can get us to where we need to go. And so the museum is attempting to do this with regenerations. There may be other exhibits, not that focus on the Sullivan collection particularly, but that the museum is working on in the future that also delve into that past, but bring out things where we can look at it in a positive light, in a productive light, and in ways that do not denigrate or take away from the humanity of anybody. And to just sort of end with a quote about education. He opuni palapala ko'u o ke kanaka pono o ia ko'u kanaka. This is from Kamehameha III, Kaui Keoli. And he reminds us that education is a significant part of being Hawaiian. It's part of the kingdom's motto at that time. And so we should be educated about our past so that we can move forward confidently into our future. And to quote our curators, hopefully who are still on, and hopefully I haven't embarrassed them too much with this really long-winded presentation, the measure of a person is immeasurable. And that's really, again, one of the things that's the heart of regenerations. So thank you very much, folks. I'm going to stop screen sharing. And if there's any questions, feel free to ask me. I'll ask that you mercifully leave Leah and Jillian out of the questions for now, but thank you very much for your time.
Okay, so well, first thing, my cat decided to join me today, and so she may or may not get up in the middle of this presentation. If he does, I'm sorry about that, but I mean, that's the burdens from working from home, right? All right, let me go ahead and share my screen and start this. Oh. Don't know what started at the end. All right. Let me stop it. Okay, there we go. Okay, so hey everyone, so today I wanted to talk to you guys about museum collections and sort of this massive amount of data that is associated with them. And so the Bishop Museum is quite obviously a fantastic resource for science, and obviously does kind of this amazing job at showcasing and preserving Native Hawaiian cultures and stories, which I tend to absolutely love. But the Bishop Museum is also the best resource in the world for Pacific Island natural history data. So this is going to be your flora, your fauna, the plants, the animals of the Pacific Islands. And so I kind of want to talk today just about how we as researchers use museums. And so maybe the part that the public doesn't get to see in order to preserve and conserve all the just absolutely gorgeous natural history around us. Because of course, you know, we don't want to lose it. But unfortunately, for a lot of species, it may be a little bit too late. So this is more for me because I am curious, but I want you guys to think about when was the last time anyone kind of went to a museum or a zoo or an aquarium of some sort, and you know, not necessarily the Bishop Museum per se, but kind of any museum. So this can be maybe an art museum, a history museum, a living museum, kind of anything that you can think of. Feel free to put it in the chat. Feel free to kind of yell at me. And specifically, do you remember which museum it was? I know like COVID kind of messed up a lot of things and made going to museums and getting in them physically difficult. But I want you to think about, you know, when and where was your last museum experience? And the reason I want to do this is because I'm going to take you guys kind of on a field trip to the Field Museum of Natural History. And this is located in Chicago, Illinois. So we go over here and we kind of enter the Field Museum. So the Field Museum is actually one of the largest natural history museums in the world, with of course, their main attraction being Sue here, who was discovered in 1990 by a female paleontologist, Susan Hendrickson. And so she is the largest and most complete T-Rex skeleton kind of ever discovered. And so, of course, you know, dinosaurs are cool and all, but I actually want to take you upstairs to the second level. And I want to take you over here to the Abbott Hall of Conservation. And the reason I want to do this is because I think the Field Museum does a really good job, especially in their exhibits, of explaining why explaining how natural history museums and the scientists that are associated with them preserve biodiversity. So this exhibit kind of first starts out by looking into the Amazon rainforest, which for the sake of time, I'm going to skip. But what is particularly interesting to us is going to be back here, which is in the reefs and islands section, of course. And so if you didn't know, in terms of natural history, islands have this incredible amount of biodiversity and endemicity. So species that are only found specifically in Hawaii. And so this exhibit particularly focuses on bird species in Madagascar. So, it talks about how this island country of Madagascar has 0.4% of Earth's landmass, but it has 5% of Earth's species in total. So, therefore we need to protect the biodiversity of these island flora and fauna. And then of course over here, it talks about the Philippines, and it talks about how the Philippines, which is another island country, has more unique mammal species per acre than any other country. And so don't get me wrong, I think birds and mammals are really cool and exciting. And in fact, the Field Museum itself has entire wings that showcase this diversity really well, and you can kind of walk through them. But if we go ahead and just walk over here for a second, I want to take a look at another diverse group that tends to be overlooked in favor of those more charismatic birds and mammals. And of course, my talk title kind of gives it away, but this group would be mollusks in particular. So this exhibit specifically looks at, the kind of the absolutely large amount of biodiversity that is in mollusks, particularly in the Florida Keys, which are of course another group of islands. But again, for the sake of this talk and like what I want to be doing, if you'll bear with me, I've kind of put together our own little exhibit of the snails in the Hawaiian Islands. So here's my tiny exhibit. So this map shouldn't really be anything surprising to you. So the dark pink parts of this map are going to be the footprint of the human population, the footprint of humans before European arrival. So it's going to be all the footprint of the native Hawaiians. And then this large pink area is going to be the footprint of humans in 2015. So basically current day. And of course, these green parts of the islands are the only parts of the islands that are still considered native, which of course are basically the highest elevations and the most difficult for us humans to kind of get to. And other Pacific islands kind of have similar footprints that look like this, where very, very small areas of the region are actually still considered native. And because of this, conservation priorities are really, really higher on islands than they are in contiguous land areas. So unfortunately, invertebrates are notoriously poorly represented in conservation management and policies, despite making up between 95 and 99% of animal diversity. So when you think about conservation and endangered species, you kind of think about these characteristic megafauna like pandas and rhinos and jaguars, which is totally fine. But in reality, they only make up less than 1% of total animal diversity. And so it can be very uneven and frustrating for us as researchers. So this 99% does include insects, which are of course undergoing, their own actual frightening collapse. And if you've heard of maybe the collapse of like the bumblebee colonies and monarch butterflies, those are only two of the absolute thousands and thousands of species that are undergoing declines and extinction now. But for today, I want to talk about the second largest invertebrate groups, and that happens to be mollusks. So can anyone here, does anyone here even actually know like what the heck a mollusk is? So can you guys like do me a favor and throw it in the chat, like what, besides obviously snails, are some mollusks? I realize I can't even see the chat, so I'm just going to give it a second and let it go. Anyway, so some types of mollusks are going to be your clams, your oysters, obviously snails and slugs. Octopus are also mollusks as well. And today I'm going to talk about the snails. And the first thing that you need to know about snails in particular is that majorly there are kind of like two types of them. You have your land snails and you have your marine snails. And so I'm primarily focusing on the land snails for today. So they're the ones you're going to find in the trees and on the ground when you're hiking or in your garden. So they're not the shells that you find on the beach or in the water. All right. So first, land. Why are we looking at snails? Why are they cool? Especially like land snails, right? So land snails have an absolute incredible species and genetic diversity. So there are about 25,000 Pacific islands, and they contain an estimated 6,000 ish land snail species, mostly species that are found on single islands. And so if everyone here kind of knows one thing about snails, it's the fact that they aren't very fast, right? They don't go very far. So populations of these snails tend to be geographically very, very, very small, like to individual plant sizes small. And so therefore, they're essentially like their own island ecosystem within islands. So they're already isolated due to being on islands themselves, right? They're already in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And now they're isolated even further just because of what they are. Again, they don't go very far, right? So this causes these sort of pockets of snail populations all around the island, which are left alone for thousands and thousands of years, and left alone for a long period of time. And over that time, they kind of evolve into these separate different species. But even within sort of these individual species, snails can have sort of these different color patterns and shell colors, which makes it difficult to kind of tell which species are which sometimes, but it makes for very, very, very pretty patterns and colors. So unfortunately, next. So more specific to Hawaii is the interesting place that the native Hawaiian snails hold in the stories and songs of native Hawaiians. So there are many names for these snails, but it's actually a mystery to which species they refer to. Hawaiian literature kind of depicts these snails as having the ability to sing, as written by missionary Nathaniel Emerson in his book, The Unwritten Literature of Hawaii. He says in his book, kahuli is a fanciful name applied to the beautiful and unique genus of tree shells, Acatenella, that inhabit Hawaiian woods. The natives are persuaded that these shells have the power of chirping a song of their own, and the writers often heard the note which they ascribed to them, but it was indistinguishable from the piping of the cricket. So unfortunately, there's a reason you don't see these shells or these snails anymore really when you're hiking. So has anyone actually seen one of these things? If you think back, to kind of any of the hikes you've done on the island, have you ever actually seen one of these things on a tree? So I've yet to really actually see any, and that makes me really, really sad because I can only kind of imagine what these things, actually look like if you're going out into the island and you see all these little, essentially tiny little jewels on the plants, right? I think that would be really, really cool to see, but unfortunately, a lot of them are all gone, and we have to figure out why. We have to conserve them. So I've been told, and kind of shown you that a majority of the reason is mostly due to human impact, right? And the fact that these guys' habitat is just so small and isolated, it's very easy to kind of wipe out an entire species. So in fact, land snails have the highest number of documented extinction of any major animal group since the 1500s. And according to the IUCN Red List, about 40% of all documented extinctions have been mollusks. And about 99% of those lost mollusks are these land snails. So one of the major threats to the Pacific Island, to these Pacific Island land snails, are something that you may have seen before. So these are called the rosy wolf snails. And so these snails were originally introduced to Hawaii on purpose in 1955 as a biological control for the African giant snail. So those are those really, really freaking big snails that you kind of see everywhere. And I'm pretty sure I've got 50 out in my yard right now. They're everywhere, right? And so, but the problem was instead of eating the snails that were 5 times the size of it, it decided to go after our native Hawaiian snails, right? And it caused a lot of our native Hawaiian snails to go extinct just within the first year of having it on the island. So of all known mollusk extinctions, actually, since the 1500, an estimated 1/3 of these were caused by this rosy wolf snail. And so the introduction of this snail was, of course, against unanimous protests of malacologists, which are people who study mollusks, whose advice was very obviously kind of ignored, right? So listen to your scientists. I think we know what we're doing. So, you know, how do we then go about fixing this? How do we kind of conserve and protect what is on our islands? So if you'll come with me back to Chicago, and we go back to our exhibit and walk over here with me. Da, da, da. We can go over here to this exhibit, and it states right over here that conservation begins with knowing what species are found where. And I'd like to also add to that statement that conservation begins with knowing what species are found where, but also at what point in time. And so luckily for us, you know, that's kind of exactly what museum collections are, right? So museum collections are in fact a library of life. You know, they contain all these specimens of information that contain information about what, where, and when these things were collected. So specimens collected a long time ago, or time capsules of information. They also contain information about invasive species, about and when, you know, those kind of first arrive, which, you know, as we know, is critical, especially on island environments, especially in island ecosystems. So now I kind of want to take you backstage and into some of the collections, so you actually see kind of like what they look like and how big they actually are. So here, for example, if we go up, is the insect collection of the Field Museum. And so insects specimens are typically stored in these drawers. So obviously these are going to be your birdwing butterflies. And then these drawers are stored in these giant cabinets, and these giant cabinets go back for rows and rows and rows and rows and rows and rows and rows. So if you can just imagine like how many specimens are in a drawer versus, you know, how many drawers can fit in a cabinet versus how many cabinets there are, and in its actual collection, you can think of the millions and millions of specimens that actually get deposited into museums quite often, actually. And so these cabinets are specifically designed to keep away light and dust from affecting any of the specimens, right? And then if we go up a level, I believe this is the botany packing area. And so what happens in botany is that plants are picked, and they're pressed against these sheets, and they're dried, and the sheets contain the information that we're talking about. And these sheets are also typically collected and kept in cabinets as well, right? And these cabinets again can contain millions and millions of specimens. And if of course we go down into the lower level, we go into the fish collection of the Field Museum. And I think if you walk over here, you can actually go down. One of these rows. Yes. So unlike, you know, unlike insects and the plants, things that have more, you know, bodies like fish and reptiles and birds are specimens that are typically collected and kept in these jars of alcohol. So this preserves the body for a really long time. And they're pretty cool to see. And if we walk over here, you can like see my absolute favorite specimen from their fish collection. He's around this corner. And he is going to be this absolutely amazing pufferfish, whose expression I think mimics kind of how we're feeling lately, right? Anyway. Let's see here, going back to the presentation. So the Bishop Museum also has millions and millions of specimens. That's what it kind of looks like behind the scenes, behind all the exhibits. We also have collections that look exactly like these. Although ours are really cool. Ours are really cool because they contain specimens that are uniquely specific to the flora and fauna, again, of the Pacific Islands. So these specimens are found nowhere else in the world. So that means any research on biodiversity and conservation of the Pacific Islands would benefit greatly from the use of Bishop Museum collections. The real problem is then getting a hold of what is in these collections, right? Especially in a pandemic where museums are closed, and it being, a research in Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, most researchers can't just kind of like pick up and visit, this museum to go visit the collections themselves. So we need records of what is kept inside of these museums and where they are located, and that's part of where the databasing comes into play. Just because of the massive amount of data that actually is inside museums. We need a way to look at it, store it, analyze it, et cetera, et cetera. So for example, in our malacology collection, we have just over 2.5 million specimens. So our goal right now is to make this data easily accessible for anybody to access, search, and download. So currently, our database can be found in an online portal. This is called Pillsbury, which stands for Pacific Island Land Snail Biodiversity Repository. And so us, along with six other malacological collections, have data that have been uploaded into this portal. So remember that exhibit earlier, if you'll think back to the field, it stated that conservation begins with knowing what species are found where. So that means there are kind of two types of data that we want to clean. So the first is going to be the what of it, right? So this is going to be kind of the names themselves of all of these specimens. So as more species are described, as more species are researched and discovered, names change over time. And so ideally, all of these specimens would have clean, up-to-date standard names that you can kind of easily search for. You don't have to search for a variety of different things to find all of the specimens for your one species of interest. The problem is a lot of these names are abbreviated like this, or I think if you scroll down, there's maybe some A's somewhere. Yeah, a lot of things are abbreviated. And these things are kind of just like messy and not up to date. And it's only because like these things were collected years and years and years ago, right? Like these are museums. And the second type of data is going to be this where. So this is going to be the location for which all of these things were found. So as you can imagine, again, some of these specimens are very, very old, and locations tend to change names through time and also through languages, right? Maps have become more accurate as technology has kind of updated, and sort of handheld devices were not as readily available as they are today. So many of these locations are just saved as text strings, right? And so all of these text strings need to be converted into these latitudes and longitudes. And this allows us to kind of like place these on maps, and we can map out where the distribution of certain things are and how they've changed over time and how they are now. And the problem here is that this can take kind of massive amounts of time, right? Just to find out where these locations are, which require, the use of either like old Hawaiian maps and field notes. But this is something that we're working on. That's something that needs to happen in order for, research to kind of continue more smoothly. And then the third thing that is going to make these specimens even more useful is going to be the images of these specimens. So books are no fun without pictures, right? Snails, however, can be difficult to image due to the fact that they are not flat. So they're a 3D object, right? So as we saw earlier, some collections are flat. So like botany is just a flat sheet of paper that you can kind of scan. However, things like snails and reptiles and birds and mammals, bones even, are not flat, and they require more than one image per specimen. So all of these images also need to be taken with a camera. They need to be then compiled and edited and uploaded into our database. So of course, getting all of this information for thousands of specimens across, because remember, we got 6 different organizations just in this alone, is not exactly easy, and it requires a bit of work. But it's also necessary, right, in order to kind of conserve and save species, unfortunately, for which many it's kind of too late. But we still want to learn about why some of these things went extinct, and so we can try to protect the extant ones against potential extinction reasons, right? So we can also learn about where native ranges for rare and endangered species that now only exist in captivity were. And that will help reestablishment in the wild and sort of things like that. And with that, I guess if there's anything that I want people to kind of take away from this is that museums are more than exhibits. The Bishop Museum in particular is just this absolutely rich resource of natural history for 4 islands. And there really are snapshots in time that we need to pay attention to, and then we need to pay attention to if we're going to conserve and protect what are on our islands. And with that, of course, I want to thank the Bishop Museum Pacific Island Land Snail crew. That's all of us over here. And of course, the Malacology collection, as well as my collaborators kind of at all these other museums, and of course, Honolulu Lunar Night for kind of letting us all take over and hopefully to teach y'all something new. And, again, thank you all for attending all of these talks and just kind of having fun with that. And with that, I'll take any questions that you guys have.